Chapter 7. Monseigneur in Town. Monseigneur, who is a high-ranking French nobleman, one of the great lords in power at the court, held his fortnightly or bi-weekly reception in his grand hotel in Paris. Monseigneur was in his inner room, his sanctuary of sanctuaries, or his most sacred place, the holiest of holies to the crowd of worshippers in the suite of rooms outside. Monseigneur was about to take his chocolate. Side note: at that time, drinking chocolate was a luxury reserved for the rich. Monseigneur could swallow a great many things with ease and was by some few sullen or gloomy minds supposed to be rather rapidly swallowing France, meaning that he was greedily consuming or destroying France like he was eating it up. But his morning's chocolate could not so much as get into the throat of Monseigneur without the aid of 4 strong men besides the cook. Yes, it took 4 men, all 4 ablaze or brightly adorned with gorgeous decoration, and the chief of them unable to exist with fewer than 2 gold watches in his pocket, emulative or imitating of the noble and chaste or pure fashion set by Monseigneur, to conduct or move the happy chocolate to Monseigneur's lips. 1 lackey or servant carried the chocolate pot into the sacred presence. A second milled and frothed or whipped and foamed the chocolate with the little instrument he bore or carried for that function. A third presented the favored napkin. A fourth, he of the 2 gold watches, or who had 2 gold watches, poured the chocolate out. It was impossible for Monseigneur to dispense with one of these attendants on the chocolate and hold his high place under the admiring heavens. Deep would have been the blot or mark upon his escutcheon or shield, meaning it would have been a stain on his family's reputation. If his chocolate had been ignobly or shamefully waited on by only 3 men, he must have died of 2. Monseigneur had been out at a little supper last night where the comedy and the grand opera were charmingly represented, meaning that he watched a theatrical comedy play and grand opera performance. Monseigneur was out at a little supper most nights, with fascinating company. So polite and so impressible or easily influenced was Monseigneur, that the comedy and the grand opera had far more influence with him in the tiresome articles, matters or topics of state affairs and state secrets than the needs of all France. In other words, he cared more about being entertained by plays and parties than about the real problems and needs of the entire country of France. A happy circumstance for France, as the like always is for all countries similarly favored, always was for England, by way of example, in the regretted days of the Mary Stuart who sold it. And here Dickens is saying that it's a terrible thing for France that its ruler is so easily influenced by entertainment, just as it was terrible for England when King Charles II or the Mary Stuart ruled and even took bribes from France. Monseigneur had one truly noble idea of general public business, which was to let everything go on in its own way, of particular public business. Monseigneur had the other truly noble idea that it must all go his way, tend to his own power and pocket. Summary: Monseigneur believed the world was made solely for his pleasure, and even claimed the earth itself belonged to him. Yet, facing growing financial problems, he had to ally himself with a greedy farmer general, who was one of the powerful tax collectors, to manage his affairs. Original text. Of his pleasures, general and particular, Monseigneur had the other truly noble idea, that the world was made for them. The text of his order, altered from the original by only a pronoun, which is not much, ran, "The earth and the fullness thereof are mine, saith Monseigneur." Yet Monseigneur had slowly found that vulgar or common embarrassments crept into his affairs, both private and public, and he had, as to both classes of affairs, allied or joined forces himself perforce out of necessity with a farmer general. Note: back then, the French government sold the right to collect taxes to wealthy private individuals called farmers general. These men paid the king a fixed sum up front, then kept whatever extra taxes they could squeeze out of the people. They were essentially tax farmers who were private contractors, and very despised, as they typically profited enormously by overtaxing the population. Summary: Monseigneur was terrible with money. Regarding public finances, he couldn't manage them at all, so he handed them over to others. For his own private finances, He was running out of money after generations of extravagant living. To solve this, he pulled his sister out of a convent just in time to stop her from becoming a nun, and married her off to a very rich but low-born farmer general as a way to bring new wealth into the family. Original text. As to public finances, because Monseigneur could not make anything at all of them, and must consequently let them out to somebody who could. As to private finances, because farmer generals were rich, and Monseigneur, after generations of great luxury and expense, was growing poor. Hence Monseigneur had taken his sister from a convent while there was still time to ward off the impending veil, which is a metaphor for her becoming a nun, the cheapest garment she could wear, and had bestowed her as a prize upon a very rich farmer general, poor in family. Which farmer general, carrying an appropriate cane with a golden apple on the top of it, was now among the company in the outer rooms, much prostrated before by mankind, or bowed down, always excepting superior mankind of the blood of Monseigneur, who, his own wife included, looked down upon him with the loftiest contempt, or highest degree of disdain. A sumptuous or luxurious man was the farmer general. 30 horses stood in his stables, 24 male domestics or servants sat in his halls, 6 body women or personal maids waited on his wife. As one who pretended to do nothing but plunder and forage or take advantage where he could, the farmer general, howsoever his matrimonial relations conduced or led to social morality, was at least the greatest reality among the personages or important people who attended at the hotel of Monseigneur that day. Summary. The rooms looked beautiful, full of expensive decorations and fancy things, but in reality they were a complete disaster if you compared them to the poor, starving people, referred to as the scarecrows in rags and nightcaps, who lived just a short distance away. The towers of Notre Dame could almost see both the rich party and the hungry poor at the same time. Original text. 4. The rooms, though a beautiful scene to look at, and adorned or decorated with every device of decoration that the taste and skill of the time could achieve, were, in truth, not a sound business, considered with any reference to the scarecrows or ragged poor in the rags and nightcaps elsewhere, and not so far off either, but that the watching towers of Notre Dame, almost equidistant or equally distant from the two extremes, could see them both. They would have been an exceedingly uncomfortable business, if that could have been anybody's business at the house of Monseigneur. Summary. The party was full of army officers who knew nothing about fighting, navy officers who knew nothing about ships, government officials who knew nothing about running the country, priests who were greedy, immoral, and fake. All of them were totally unqualified for their jobs. They only had those positions because they were connected to rich, powerful people like Monseigneur. There were also plenty of other useless people. Fake doctors getting rich by selling fancy medicine for illnesses that didn't even exist. Dreamers and talkers who claimed they had grand plans to fix society, but never actually did real work. Philosophers talking big ideas but building nothing real, like card towers of Babel, pretty but useless and bound to collapse. And rich, fashionable gentlemen who were exhausted from doing nothing useful with their lives. Most of the rich women at the party acted like they weren't even mothers. They dressed up, partied, and pretended to be young and carefree, while poor peasant women were the ones actually raising children. Original text. Military officers destitute or lacking of military knowledge. Naval officers with no idea of a ship. Civil or government officers without a notion or understanding of affairs. Brazen ecclesiastics or church officials of the worst worldly, with sensual eyes, loose tongues, and looser lives, meaning that they were living sinful lives behind closed doors, all totally unfit for their several callings, all lying horribly in pretending to belong to them, but all nearly or remotely of the order of Monseigneur, and therefore foisted or placed on all public employments from which anything was to be got. These were to be told off by the score or counted in large numbers. Original text. People not immediately connected with Monseigneur or the state, yet equally unconnected with anything that was real, or with lives passed in traveling by any straight road to any true earthly end, were no less abundant. meaning that these rich, fashionable people lived lives with no direction or purpose. They wandered aimlessly, just partying and showing off. Doctors who made great fortunes out of dainty remedies for imaginary disorders that never existed smiled upon their courtly patients in the antechambers or waiting rooms of Monseigneur. Projectors, or those who created schemes or plans, who had discovered every kind of remedy for the little evils with which the state was touched, except the remedy of setting to work in earnest to root out a single sin, poured their distracting babble or meaningless talk into any ears they could lay hold of at the reception of Monseigneur. Unbelieving philosophers who were remodeling the world with words and making card towers of babble to scale the skies with, talked with unbelieving chemists who had an eye on the transmutation of metals, or atheistic chemists who were obsessed with turning cheap metals into gold, at this wonderful gathering accumulated by Monseigneur. Summary. These rich, fashionable men acted like being bored and exhausted was a sign of superiority. They didn't care about real problems, like the poor people starving in Paris. They just dressed up, went to parties, and acted superior. At this fancy party, the rich women were all dressed up, acting young, carefree, and sophisticated. They behaved as if they had no children at all. They partied, flirted, and tried to look glamorous instead of acting like mothers. Original text. Exquisite or refined gentlemen of the finest breeding, which was at that remarkable time, and has been since, to be known by its fruits or results of indifference to every natural subject of human interest, were in the most exemplary or perfect state of exhaustion at the hotel of Monseigneur. Such homes had these various notabilities, or famous or important people, left behind them in the fine world of Paris, that the spies among the assembled devotees or followers of Monseigneur, forming a goodly or respectable half of the polite company, would have found it hard to discover among the angels of that sphere or class of people one solitary wife who, in her manners and appearance, owned to being a mother. Indeed, except for the mere act of bringing a troublesome creature into this world, which does not go far towards the realization of the name of mother, there was no such thing known to the fashion. Peasant or working-class women kept the unfashionable babies close and brought them up, and charming grandmammas of 60 dressed and supped or dined as at 20. The leprosy or disease of unreality disfigured every human creature in attendance upon Monseigneur. In the outermost room were half a dozen exceptional people who had had for a few years some vague misgiving or feeling in them that things in general were going rather wrong. Summary. A small group of 6 people at the party were worried that society was heading in the wrong direction. So, half of them, or 3 people, had joined a weird religious group called the Convulsionists. At that very moment, they were seriously thinking about having a dramatic, crazy fit right there in the middle of the party, foaming at the mouth, screaming, raging, and falling into a trance-like state. They believed this wild behavior would act like a clear sign or warning about the future to help guide Monseigneur. Original text. As a promising way of setting them right, half of the half-dozen had become members of a fantastic sect of convulsionists, and were even then considering within themselves whether they should foam, rage, roar, and turn cataleptic or fall into a trance on the spot, thereby setting up a highly intelligible finger-post to the future for Monseigneur's guidance. Summary. Besides the convulsionists, or the people having crazy fits, there were 3 more people who had joined a different weird religious group. This group used fancy, confusing talk jargon about something called the center of truth. They believed humanity had wandered away from the true center of all wisdom and goodness. This part was obvious. No one needed it explained. But people hadn't completely flown away from the outer edge of the circumference, and the solution was to stop people from flying off completely and to push them back to the center by starving themselves, fasting, and trying to see ghosts or spirits. Original text. Besides these dervishes, or religious ascetics, were other 3 who had rushed into another sect, which mended or fixed matters with a jargon or confusing language about the center of truth, holding that man had got out of the center of truth, which did not need much demonstration, but had not got out of the circumference or outer boundary, and that he was to be kept from flying out of the circumference, and was even to be shoved back into the center by fasting and seeing of spirits. Summary. Among these rich, silly people, there was a lot of talking to ghosts and spirits, and it did a tremendous amount of good that nobody ever actually saw. The only good thing, and Dickens is being very sarcastic, you could say about this party was that everyone was dressed beautifully. If Judgment Day, when God judges everyone, had been declared a formal dress day, then every single person there would have been perfectly ready for all of eternity. Original text. Among these, accordingly, much discoursing or conversation with spirits went on, and it did a world of good which never became manifest or never came about. But the comfort was that all the company at the Grand Hotel of Monseigneur were perfectly dressed. If the day of judgment had only been ascertained or decided to be a dress day, everybody there would have been eternally correct. Such frizzling or curling and powdering and sticking up of hair, such delicate complexions or skin tone, artificially preserved and mended, such gallant or showy swords to look at, and such delicate honor to the sense of smell, would surely keep anything going, for ever and ever. The exquisite or elegant gentlemen of the finest breeding wore little pendant or hanging trinkets that chinked as they languidly or slowly moved. These golden fetters or shackles rang like precious little bells, and what with that ringing, and with the rustle of silk and brocade or rich fabric and fine linen, there was a flutter in the air that fanned or cooled Saint Antoine in his devouring hunger far away. Dress was the one unfailing talisman or amulet and charm used for keeping all things in their places. Everybody was dressed for a fancy ball that was never to leave off, meaning that it would never end. From the Palace of the Tuileries, which is a royal palace in Paris, through Monseigneur and the whole court, through the chambers, the tribunals of justice, and all society, except the scarecrows or the ragged poor, the fancy ball descended to the common executioner, who, in pursuance of the charm, or in keeping with tradition, was required to officiate or perform his duties frizzled or with curled hair, powdered, in a gold-laced coat, pumps or shoes, and white silk stockings, at the gallows and the wheel, which is a torture device. The axe was a rarity. Monsieur Paris, as it was the episcopal or related to a bishop, mode or custom among his brother professors of the provinces or regions. Monsieur Orleans and the rest presided or led in this dainty dress. Summary. They acted like their fancy clothes and fake perfection were the most important things in the universe, so important that even the stars would have to stop shining in respect. Original text. And who among the company at Monseigneur's reception in that 1780th year of our Lord could possibly doubt that a system rooted or based in a frizzled or curled hair hangman, powdered, gold-laced pumped, and white silk stockinged would see the very stars out, or last until the end of time? Summary. After 4 servants helped him drink his hot chocolate, one of his ridiculous daily luxuries, Monseigneur dramatically came out of his private inner room. As soon as Monseigneur appeared, everyone in the room started groveling pathetically, bowing deeply, flattering him, acting like slaves, and showing total, degrading humiliation. The people bowed so extremely low, both physically and in their hearts, to Monseigneur that there was nothing left to give to God. They had used up all their humility and worship on this arrogant, rich lord, so they didn't bother praying to heaven or God anymore. Original text. Monseigneur, having eased his 4 men of their burdens and taken his chocolate, caused the doors of the holiest of holiestes, or the most sacred place, to be thrown open, and issued or came forth. Then, what submission, what cringing and fawning, what servility or willingness to serve, what abject or hopeless humiliation. As to bowing down in body and spirit, nothing in that way was left for heaven, which may have been one among other reasons why the worshippers of Monseigneur never troubled it. Summary. The following paragraphs describe the end of Monseigneur's reception. The flutter is the rustling of silk dresses and the buzz of conversation, which turns into a noisy rush as everyone leaves. The precious little bells are the servants' bells, or the jingling of fine accessories as the guests hurry down the stairs. Original text. Bestowing or giving a word of promise here, and a smile there, a whisper on one happy slave, and a wave of the hand on another. Monseigneur affably or pleasantly passed through his rooms to the remote region of the circumference of truth or outer circle of belief. There, Monseigneur turned and came back again, and so in due course of time got himself shut up in his sanctuary by the chocolate sprites or servants, and was seen no more. The show being over, the flutter in the air became quite a little storm, and the precious little bells went ringing downstairs. There was soon but one person left of all the crowd, and he, with his hat under his arm and his snuff-box in his hand. Note: snuff is powdered tobacco, and a snuff-box is a small box for storing powdered tobacco. Slowly passed among the mirrors on his way out. "I devote or curse you," said this person, stopping at the last door on his way and turning in the direction of the sanctuary, "to the devil." With that, he shook the snuff from his fingers as if he had shaken the dust from his feet, and quietly walked downstairs. He was a man of about 60, handsomely dressed, haughty or arrogant in manner, and with a face like a fine mask, a face of a transparent paleness, every feature in it clearly defined, one set expression on it. The nose, beautifully formed otherwise, was very slightly pinched at the top of each nostril. In those two compressions or dints, meaning indentations or small dents, the only little change that the face ever showed resided. They persisted in changing color sometimes, and they would be occasionally dilated or expanded and contracted by something like a faint pulsation or slight movement. Then they gave a look of treachery and cruelty to the whole countenance or facial expression. Examined with attention, its capacity of helping such a look was to be found in the line of the mouth, and the lines of the orbits of the eyes, or eye sockets, being much too horizontal and thin. Still, in the effect of the face made, it was a handsome face, and a remarkable one. Its owner went downstairs into the courtyard, got into his carriage, and drove away. Not many people had talked with him at the reception. He had stood in a little space apart, and Monseigneur might have been warmer in his manner or friendliness. It appeared, under the circumstances, rather agreeable to him to see the common people dispersed or scattered before his horses, and often barely escaping from being run down. Summary. People sometimes complained, even in a city that ignored complaints and in an era that stayed silent about injustice, that rich nobles drove their carriages extremely fast and recklessly through the narrow streets, which had no sidewalks. This dangerous driving often injured or crippled ordinary poor people in cruel ways. However, almost nobody cared enough to think about it twice. Just like in every other matter, the poor were left to deal with their problems on their own. Original text. The complaint had sometimes made itself audible, even in that deaf city and dumb or unresponsive age, that in the narrow streets without footways or sidewalks, the fierce patrician or noble class custom of hard driving endangered and maimed or injured the mere vulgar or common people in a barbarous or cruel manner. But few cared enough for that to think of it a second time, and in this matter, as in all others, the common wretches or poor people were left to get out of their difficulties as they could. With a wild rattle and clatter, and an inhuman abandonment of consideration not easy to be understood in these days, the carriage dashed through streets and swept round corners, with women screaming before it and men clutching each other and clutching children out of its way. At last, swooping at a street corner by a fountain, one of its wheels came to a sickening little jolt, and there was a loud cry from a number of voices, and the horses reared and plunged. But for the latter inconvenience, the carriage probably would not have stopped. Carriages were often known to drive on and leave their wounded behind, and why not? But the frightened valet had got down in a hurry, and there were 20 hands at the horses' bridles. "What has gone wrong?" said Monsieur, calmly looking out. A tall man in a nightcap had caught up a bundle from among the feet of the horses, and had laid it on the basement of the fountain, and was down in the mud and wet, howling over it like a wild animal. "Pardon, Monsieur the Marquis," said a ragged and submissive man, "it is a child." Why does he make that abominable or monstrous noise? Is it his child? Excuse me, Monsieur the Marquis, it is a pity, yes. The fountain was a little removed, for the street opened where it was into a space some 10 or 12 yards square, as the tall man suddenly got up from the ground and came running at the carriage. Monsieur the Marquis clapped his hand for an instant on his sword hilt. "Killed!" shrieked the man, in wild desperation, extending both arms at their length above his head and staring at him. "Dead!" The people closed round and looked at Monsieur the Marquis. There was nothing revealed by the many eyes that looked at him but watchfulness and eagerness. There was no visible menacing or threatening or anger, neither did the people say anything. After the first cry they had been silent, and they remained so. The voice of the submissive man who had spoken was flat and tame in its extreme submission. Monsieur the Marquis ran his eyes over them all, as if they had been mere rats come out of their holes. He took out his purse. "It is extraordinary to me," said he, "that you people cannot take care of yourselves and your children. One or the other of you is forever in the way. How do I know what injury you have done my horses? See, give him that." He threw out a gold coin for the valet to pick up, and all the heads craned forward that all the eyes might look down at it as it fell. The tall man called out again with a most unearthly cry, "Dead!" He was arrested by the quick arrival of another man, for whom the rest made way. On seeing him, the miserable creature fell upon his shoulder, sobbing and crying, and pointing to the fountain, where some women were stooping over the motionless bundle and moving gently about it. They were as silent, however, as the men. I know all," said the last comer. "Be a brave man, my Gaspard. It is better for the poor little plaything to die so than to live. It has died in a moment without pain. Could it have lived an hour as happily? You are a philosopher or thinker, you there," said the Marquis, smiling. "How do they call you?" "They call me Defarge." "Of what trade?" "Monsieur the Marquis, vendor or seller of wine." "Pick up that, philosopher and vendor of wine," said the Marquis, throwing him another gold coin, "and spend it as you will. The horses there, are they right?" Without deigning or lowering himself to look at the assemblage or group a second time, Monsieur the Marquis leaned back in his seat and was just being driven away with the air of a gentleman who had accidentally broke some common thing and had paid for it and could afford to pay for it, when his ease was suddenly disturbed by a coin flying into his carriage and ringing on its floor. "Hold," said Monsieur the Marquis, "hold the horses. Who threw that?" He looked to the spot where Defarge the vendor of wine had stood a moment before, but the wretched father was groveling on his face on the pavement in that spot, and the figure that stood beside him was the figure of a dark, stout woman, knitting. "You dogs," said the Marquis, but smoothly, and with an unchanged front, except as to the spots on his nose. "I would ride over any of you very willingly and exterminate you from the earth, if I knew which rascal threw at the carriage, and if that brigand or outlaw were sufficiently near it, he should be crushed under the wheels." So cowed or frightened was their condition, and so long and hard their experience of what such a man could do to them, within the law and beyond it, that not a voice, or a hand, or even an eye was raised. Among the men, not one. But the woman who stood knitting looked up steadily and looked the Marquis in the face. It was not for his dignity to notice it. His contemptuous or scornful eyes passed over her, and over all the other rats, and he leaned back in his seat again and gave the word, "Go on." He was driven on, and other carriages came whirling by in quick succession, or one after another. The minister, the state projector, or the people who came up with grand crackpot schemes for improving the government or the state, the farmer general or tax collectors, the doctor, the lawyer, the ecclesiastic or clergyman, the grand opera, the comedy, the whole fancy ball in a bright continuous flow came whirling by. The rats had crept out of their holes to look on, and they remained looking on for hours, soldiers and police often passing between them and the spectacle or sight, and making a barrier behind which they slunk and through which they peeped. The father had long ago taken up his bundle and bidden himself away or left with it, when the women who had tended the bundle while it lay on the base of the fountain, sat there watching the running of the water and the rolling of the fancy ball, when the one woman who had stood conspicuous knitting still knitted on with the steadfastness or determination of fate. The water of the fountain ran, the swift river ran, the day ran into evening. So much life in the city ran into death according to rule. Time and tide waited for no man. The rats were sleeping close together in their dark holes again. The fancy ball was lighted up at supper. All things ran their course, which means that while the rich nobles danced and enjoyed themselves in their bright, beautiful world, the poor were starving and dying in the dark. But life continued as normal for both groups. Thank you for joining us through this chapter of A Tale of Two Cities. If you're enjoying the story, the vocabulary lessons, and the background information that makes this classic novel more coherent, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's keep learning together. See you in the next chapter.